The Mahama-led administration is taking bold policy steps to correct structural imbalances in the sector. By 2026, the government will implement a phased ban on the export of raw shea nuts. Ghana must move from being a raw material exporter to a nation of value-added excellence.
Ghana Shea Employers Association has made a plea to government to impose a ban on the exportation of shea nuts. According to the association, the exportation of the nuts is having a detrimental impact on local businesses, threatening their survival.
For years, the United States treated Ghana's shea supply as guaranteed, automatic, uninterrupted, unquestioned. Then Ghana pulled the plug, not with threats, not with headlines, but with policy. Overnight, raw shea exports tightened, supply chains stalled, and American industries realized they were exposed in ways they never imagined. And this wasn't a trade dispute, it was a power shift. Ghana didn't walk away from the market. It moved up the ladder, and in doing so, it forced the United States to confront a new reality. Access is no longer automatic, and producers are no longer silent, because when a supplier becomes a strategist, the entire global trade game changes.
The association has decried the increasing presence of foreign buyers coming into the localities to purchase raw shea nut in bulk for export. They argue that the exportation deprives local industries of the raw materials they need to operate, thereby stifling their growth and development. According to the Organic Trade and Investment Report, Ghana produces up to 60,000 metric tons of shea nuts annually from approximately 94 million shea trees.
For decades, the global shea nut trade moved quietly, largely unnoticed by the public, but deeply embedded in supply chains across cosmetics, food, and pharmaceuticals. At the center of that trade stood Ghana, one of the world's most critical producers. For years, the United States benefited from this arrangement, importing vast quantities of raw shea at stable prices, confident that access would remain uninterrupted. That confidence would soon prove misplaced. The shift began with policy reviews inside Ghana that few outside the region paid attention to. Reports highlighted a familiar imbalance. Ghana exported raw shea nuts cheaply while value-added processing, branding, and profits accumulated abroad. Rural communities bore environmental and labor pressures, while finished products generated wealth elsewhere. Ghana decided that arrangement had run its course. The announcement came. Without drama. A temporary export restriction on raw shea nuts, framed as a domestic industrial protection measure. Official language emphasized sustainability, local processing, and economic resilience. But global markets understood the implication immediately. This was not a temporary pause. It was a signal. The United States reacted with surprise. For years, American companies had built entire product lines around uninterrupted shea imports. Contracts assumed continuity, warehouses operated on predictable cycles. The idea that Ghana would willingly disrupt this flow seemed unthinkable to many analysts who still viewed African producers as price takers rather than policy setters. They were wrong. Ghana's strategy was deliberate. Rather than banning all trade, it redirected it. Exports of processed shea butter and semi-finished inputs were encouraged. Incentives favored domestic refineries and cooperatives. Infrastructure investment accelerated around production zones. Ghana was not leaving the market, it was moving up the value chain. The United States faced an uncomfortable adjustment. Raw shea shortages pushed prices upward. Alternative suppliers lacked Ghana's scale and quality consistency. Substitution proved costly and inefficient. American firms scrambled to renegotiate contracts, only to discover that Ghana's negotiating position had strengthened overnight. Trade tension followed swiftly. Diplomatic channels opened. Statements emphasized partnership and mutual benefit. Ghana listened but did not reverse course. The policy was framed as non-negotiable. Economic sovereignty, Ghana argued, was not a bargaining chip. Behind the scenes, the implications rippled outward. American manufacturers experienced margin pressure, supply chain managers confronted uncertainty, long-term planning models had not accounted for producer-led restriction, share prices wavered as analysts revised risk assessments. Shea, once a stable input, had become a variable. Ghana's move resonated beyond the United States. Other importing nations took note. Some adapted quickly, seeking processed shea from Ghana under new terms. Others hesitated, hoping the restriction would be lifted. Ghana used this divergence strategically, rewarding early adaptation with preferential access. The global narrative shifted. No longer was Ghana simply a supplier, it was a gatekeeper. Domestic impact inside Ghana was immediate. Processing facilities expanded, employment increased, local value retention improved, rural incomes stabilized as cooperatives gained pricing power. For the first time, the shea trade felt aligned with national development goals rather than external demand. This success reinforced resolve. The United States, accustomed to shaping trade norms, now found itself reacting to them. Attempts to frame the restriction as market disruption gained little traction. International observers increasingly recognized Ghana's policy as a rational development strategy rather than an act of hostility. Trade tension did not escalate into confrontation, but unease lingered. American policymakers worried about precedent. If Ghana could assert control over shea, what would stop other producers from doing the same with other commodities? The assumption of uninterrupted access suddenly looked fragile. Ghana was aware of this anxiety, but the decision was not about leverage alone, it was about memory. Ghana remembered decades of exporting raw materials while importing finished goods at higher prices. The shea restriction was a correction, not a provocation. Markets adjusted slowly. Some American firms explored partnerships with Ghanaian processors. Others invested directly in local facilities under Ghanaian regulations. Those willing to adapt found opportunity. Those resistant faced prolonged disruption. The trade tension revealed a deeper shift in global economics. Producer nations were no longer content with extraction-based roles. They sought participation across the value chain. Ghana's shea policy became a case study in strategic resource governance. The United States could still access shea, but not on old terms. This recalibration challenged assumptions long embedded in global trade. Access was no longer guaranteed by demand alone. It required alignment with producer priorities. Ghana's move did not isolate the United States, it rebalanced the relationship. Yet, for American industries built on predictability, the change felt abrupt. Planning cycles shortened, risk premiums increased. A once invisible commodity now carried geopolitical weight. Ghana remained steady. Officials reiterated that the policy aimed at sustainability and development, not punishment, but the message was clear. Control over resources belonged to the producer. Participation was welcome. Dependence was not. As trade negotiations continued quietly, one reality settled in across global markets. Ghana had demonstrated that even a single commodity, when managed strategically, could shift power dynamics. And once that realization took hold, the shea nut export ban was no longer just a trade story. It was a warning. The era of unquestioned access was ending. As Ghana's shea export restrictions settled into place, its long-term consequences began reshaping global trade behavior in ways few had anticipated. What initially appeared to be a targeted industrial policy evolved into a broader redefinition of how producer nations could exercise economic authority without provoking open conflict. The United States adjusted publicly with restraint, but privately with urgency. Supply chain audits were launched across industries dependent on shea derivatives. Cosmetic manufacturers reassessed product formulations. Food producers explored alternative fats. Pharmaceutical companies reconsidered sourcing strategies, yet every alternative revealed the same truth. Ghana's dominance in quality and scale could not be replicated quickly. Ghana understood this advantage and used it carefully. Rather than tightening restrictions further, Ghana focused on institutional strength. Quality standards were formalized. Export licensing emphasized traceability and sustainability. Domestic processors were supported through training and financing. The message to global markets was consistent. Ghana was not closing doors, but it was changing the rules of entry. This approach reduced backlash. International observers increasingly framed Ghana's policy as pragmatic rather than aggressive. Comparisons emerged between Ghana's shea strategy and earlier resource governance models elsewhere. Unlike abrupt nationalizations of the past, Ghana's method relied on gradual recalibration. The market was given time to adjust, but not permission to ignore the shift. Trade tension with the United States persisted beneath the surface. American negotiators sought exemptions and transitional arrangements. Ghana listened but refused to dilute its objectives. Any access to raw shea would be temporary and conditional. Long-term agreements favored processed exports and local investment commitments. This stands for strategic choices. Some American firms chose adaptation. Joint ventures were established with Ghanaian processors. Technology transfer agreements emerged. Training programs linked Ghanaian cooperatives with advanced manufacturing practices. These firms regained supply stability, albeit at higher cost and reduced margins. Others resisted. Companies unwilling to invest locally faced prolonged shortages. Their competitive positions weakened. Market share shifted to firms that aligned with Ghana's framework. Over time, adaptation became not just advantageous, but necessary. The ripple effects extended beyond the United States. European and Asian markets took note of Ghana's firmness. Importers adjusted expectations. The idea that raw material access could be conditional rather than automatic gained legitimacy, producer nations observed Ghana closely, studying its balance of assertiveness and restraint. Inside Ghana, the policy reshaped rural economies. Shea-producing regions experienced infrastructure upgrades. Processing plants reduced reliance on seasonal labor volatility. Value retention improved fiscal stability. Government revenues increased modestly but sustainably. More importantly, the shea sector became a pillar of industrial confidence. This confidence mattered. Ghana's success emboldened policymakers to explore similar frameworks in other sectors. Agricultural commodities, minerals, and energy resources were reviewed through the same lens. How much value left the country unnecessarily, and how much could be retained without isolating markets? The United States recognized the broader implication. Ghana's move signaled a shift in Africa's economic posture. Trade relationships would increasingly be shaped by producer priorities rather than importer convenience. This did not eliminate cooperation, but it changed its terms. Diplomatic language softened accordingly. Public statements emphasized partnership, sustainability, and shared growth. Ghana welcomed the tone but maintained policy. Consistency, trust, it argued, was built through alignment, not pressure. Markets stabilized gradually, shea prices normalized at higher levels, supply chains restructured, consumers absorbed modest cost increases. The initial shock faded, replaced by a new equilibrium that reflected Ghana's enhanced role. Yet the psychological impact lingered. The United States had not lost access to shea entirely, but it had lost certainty. That loss altered planning assumptions far beyond a single commodity. Risk models incorporated producer agency more prominently. Diversification strategies accelerated. Ghana remained composed. Officials resisted the temptation to expand restrictions aggressively. Overreach could invite backlash. Instead, Ghana focused on execution. Consistency reinforced credibility. Credibility sustained leverage. The shea export ban, once described as a temporary measure, became a reference point in global trade discussions. Analysts cited it as evidence that development-focused trade policy could succeed without destabilizing markets. The lesson was clear. Control did not require confrontation. Influence did not require isolation. Ghana had demonstrated that quiet resolve could reshape relationships more effectively than loud defiance. The United States adjusted accordingly. Investment flowed into Ghanaian processing capacity. Long-term contracts reflected shared risk rather than unilateral advantage. While tensions never fully disappeared, they evolved into negotiation rather than dispute. The global system absorbed the change. Ghana's shea policy did not trigger collapse or retaliation. It triggered adaptation, and adaptation, once complete, revealed a more balanced trade environment. As the dust settled, one reality stood firm. Ghana had moved from supplier to strategist. The United States had moved from assumption to adjustment, and in that shift, the meaning of access itself had changed. No longer was it guaranteed by demand alone. It was earned through alignment, investment, and respect for producer sovereignty. The shea nut export ban had done more than spark trade tension. It had rewritten expectations.